There's something most people don't understand about empaths. Something so disturbing, it will shatter everything you believe about your gift. You've been told it's beautiful. This ability to feel everything, to absorb the emotions of others like a psychic sponge. Society celebrates your sensitivity. Therapists call you gifted spiritual teachers, claim you're evolved souls here to heal the world. But what if I told you that this very gift has become your prison? What if your deepest compassion is actually the doorway through which you've been enslaved in the most ancient and unconscious game of power humanity has ever known? Before we dive deeper, if this resonates with your soul's journey, please hit that like button and subscribe for more transformational content. Your support helps this message reach other souls who need to hear it. I am speaking not of sentimental caricatures of those who merely feel deeply, not of the popular conception of empaths as gentle souls who simply care too much. I speak of a profound psychological condition where the very boundaries of the self dissolve before invisible tides of the unconscious, where the individual becomes porous, transparent to psychic impressions, but as a wound to currents that move through the collective like underground rivers of raw emotion, archetypal force, and unconscious material that belongs to the species rather than the individual. The empath exists not simply within their own psyche, as most humans do, but becomes a vessel, a living, breathing repository for the suffering, the desires, the unprocessed shadows of others. They live not merely their own life, but become unwitting carriers of the emotional debris that others cannot bear to face in themselves. You know this feeling with devastating intimacy, don't you? That crushing heaviness that descends after being with certain people, as if you've absorbed their entire emotional world into your own body. That bone-deep exhaustion that has no physical cause, no logical explanation, yet leaves you feeling as though you've run a marathon through someone else's psychological landscape. That overwhelming sense of carrying invisible burdens that aren't yours yet somehow feel more real, more urgent, more important than your own life, your own needs, your own dreams. You've been taught to call this sensitivity a spiritual gift from the universe, a sign of your evolved consciousness. But I call it something else, entirely unconscious participation in the eternal game of domination and submission that has governed human relationships since the beginning of consciousness itself. Consider this fundamental truth carefully. Every human being lives not merely by bread or the labor of their hands, but by symbols, by energies that course through the soul like unseen rivers of meaning and power. These invisible currents of psychic energy flow between people, constantly creating webs of influence, dependence control, and exchange that operate far below the threshold of conscious awareness. And when you open yourself to another without discernment, without consciousness of what lurks in the shadow of every human interaction, you are inevitably drawn into the oldest drama of all, the invisible exchange of power between souls. This is not malice alone that creates this game, though malice certainly plays its part. It is archetypal necessity, the fundamental law of opposites that governs the psyche, like gravity governs physical matter. Where there is openness, influence must arise like air, rushing into a vacuum. Where there is yielding, force must emerge to fill the space that has been created. Where there is dissolution of boundaries, possession becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Where there is excessive giving, endless taking must follow as surely as night follows day. And you, dear empath, with your porous boundaries and your compulsive need to heal and help and save, have become the perfect stage upon which these ancient dramas are enacted, often without your knowing, always to your detriment, sometimes to your complete destruction. But here is what may shock you most profoundly. This is not happening to you by random accident or cruel fate. Your very identity, your core sense of self-worth, your entire way of being in the world has been unconsciously constructed over years or decades to ensure your participation in this game. You are not merely an innocent victim of circumstance. You are an unwitting but active player in a psychological drama that began long before you were born, rooted in archetypal patterns that have shaped human consciousness for millennia. The empath's gift is also their curse. Their strength is also their weakness. Their greatest virtue conceals their most dangerous vulnerability. And until you understand this paradox at the deepest level, until you can see both the light and shadow of your nature simultaneously, you will remain trapped in patterns that drain your life force and prevent you from ever becoming who you truly are. Let me tell you what I've witnessed in countless souls who came to me, broken, drained, consumed by emotions that belonged to others. They entered my office like ghosts of themselves, speaking as though they carried invisible burdens they could not put down, as if they were living multiple lives simultaneously, their own and everyone else's. They described feeling responsible for everyone's happiness, while being unable to experience their own guilty when others suffered, even when they had no role in causing that suffering, empty and purposeless, when they weren't actively needed by someone in crisis. These individuals spoke of exhaustion that sleep could not cure, of depression that had no apparent cause in their own circumstances, of anxiety that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They described homes that felt like emotional battlefields, even when nothing overtly dramatic was happening. Relationships that drained them while giving nothing back, and a persistent sense that they were living someone else's life, while their own authentic existence remained locked away, inaccessible, perhaps even forgotten. And they were absolutely right to feel this way, for they had allowed themselves, unconsciously, innocently, but completely, to be caught in what I call the archetypal net, a psychological trap that operates through the deepest patterns of human consciousness. You cannot play the savior without conjuring the tyrant. This is the secret danger hidden within compassion, the shadow of domination that follows every act of rescue like a hungry ghost. The moment you position yourself as the one who heals, fixes, or saves, you automatically create the complementary dynamic of the one who needs healing, fixing, or saving. The moment you become the compulsive giver, you inevitably summon the endless taker. The moment you dissolve your boundaries in service of another's pain, you send out an unconscious invitation to the forces that will consume you. The empath you see is not merely kind-hearted or naturally compassionate. They are compelled by forces far greater than conscious choice, driven by psychological mechanisms that operate below the threshold of awareness. Something within their psyche has become aligned with the archetype of the eternal healer, the cosmic mother, the sacrificial redeemer. Powerful archetypal energies that have shaped human consciousness since the beginning of civilization. But here lies the fatal misunderstanding that destroys so many sensitive souls in awakening this luminous aspect of their nature. They simultaneously and inevitably summon its shadow counterpart. The healer conjures the manipulator who feeds on gratitude and emotional dependency. The savior attracts the vampire who drains life force while giving nothing in return. The selfless giver activates the controller who enslaves others through apparent sacrifice and martyrdom. Every gift summons its shadow. Every light calls forth its corresponding darkness. Every strength creates its own particular weakness. Every virtue, when lived unconsciously, becomes a vice. And unless you learn to hold this tension consciously, to see both sides of your nature simultaneously, without denial or judgment, you will be systematically drained, psychologically devoured, left hollow and depleted by the very people you sought to love and heal. But why does this devastating pattern occur with such predictable regularity? Why doesn't the empath simply withdraw when they recognize the danger, guard their energy, assert their autonomy and self-respect? The answer lies in understanding that their very identity, their core sense of self, has been constructed upon a fundamental lie that was planted in childhood and reinforced throughout their development, that their worth depends entirely upon their usefulness to others, that to feel for others is the only way to exist, that matters, that their value lies not in their essential being, but in their endless doing for others. This belief was not chosen freely in some moment of conscious decision. It was forged in the fires of childhood experience, hammered into shape by circumstances that taught them their survival depended upon their ability to sense and respond to others' needs while suppressing their own. Perhaps it was emotional neglect that taught them others' needs mattered more than their own survival. Perhaps it was abandonment that showed them love was conditional upon their performance of care. Perhaps it was trauma that required them to become hypervigilant to others' emotional states as a matter of physical and psychological safety. To survive in families where love was scarce, unpredictable, or dangerous, they developed extraordinary sensitivity as a survival mechanism. They learned to attune to the subtlest moods of others with microscopic precision, to anticipate unspoken needs before they became angry demands, to sense emotional danger brewing in the atmosphere before it erupted into chaos that could destroy them. This extraordinary sensitivity became their most reliable tool for maintaining some semblance of safety in an unpredictable and often hostile world. But this survival strategy, refined through years of practice and reinforced by repeated success in keeping them safe, gradually became the foundation of their adult identity. What began as necessity crystallized into compulsion. What started as adaptation became prison. The hypervigilance that once protected them now enslaves them, making them exquisitely sensitive to every emotional fluctuation in their environment, while remaining mysteriously blind to their own needs, their own boundaries, their own legitimate right to exist independently of others' requirements. This is why empaths so often describe feeling like they live in a house of mirrors surrounded by reflections that are not their own. They become experts at reading others while losing the ability to read themselves, masters of others' emotions while remaining strangers to their own inner landscape. They can sense a shift in someone's mood from across a room, but cannot identify their own feelings. They can diagnose others' psychological patterns with uncanny accuracy, but remain blind to the forces that drive their own behavior. Think of the dreams that plague sensitive souls with haunting regularity. Houses filled with voices that are not their own rooms, crowded with emotions that cannot escape endless corridors that lead always to other people's crises, while their own room remains forever locked, unreachable, perhaps even forgotten. They awaken heavy, drenched in perspiration, emotionally drained, as if they have lived through the complete emotional experiences of 100 different souls throughout the night. This is no mere metaphor or symbolic representation of psychological states. It is the literal psychic reality of one whose boundaries have been colonized by the projections of others, whose inner world has become a repository for the unconscious material that others cannot bear to face in themselves. Their psyche becomes a dumping ground for the emotional waste products of everyone around them, while their own authentic self retreats deeper and deeper into hiding, perhaps disappearing entirely. Now we must venture into darker territory. For what I am about to reveal may disturb your most cherished beliefs about your own nature, may shatter the very foundation upon which you have built your identity and sense of purpose in the world. You may believe that your empathy makes you holy, that your capacity to absorb others' emotions elevates you into some chosen caste of souls spiritually evolved beyond the crude selfishness of ordinary humans who care only for themselves. You may see your sensitivity as proof of your advanced consciousness, your compassion as evidence of your moral superiority, your willingness to sacrifice as a sign of your enlightenment. But beware such illusions, for they are the very mechanisms by which the shadow operates most effectively. The more convinced you become of your own virtue, the more blind you become to your own darkness. The more you identify with the light, the more unconscious your shadow becomes. The more you pride yourself on your selflessness, the more your hidden selfishness grows in the darkness of your unconscious mind. Every virtue that shines brilliantly in the conscious mind conceals a corresponding vice in the unconscious depths. To proclaim yourself selfless is already to harbor secret resentment against those who take from you without acknowledgement or reciprocation. To call yourself pure is to deny the envy, pride, manipulation, and control that lurks in your shadow, growing stronger every day, that you refuse to acknowledge its existence. To claim that you feel everything is to confess that you have lost the boundary of the self and allowed yourself to be possessed by the chaos of forces far beyond your conscious control. The game of power is infinitely more subtle and sophisticated than most people imagine. It is not only the obvious tyrant who wields power through force and intimidation, the crude narcissist who demands attention and admiration, or the blatant manipulator who lies and schemes to get their way. Power also operates through the victim, who manipulates others through their suffering, making their pain into a weapon that controls others' behavior. It operates through the savior, who controls others through their rescuing, creating dependency and gratitude that becomes a form of emotional bondage. And yes, it operates through the empath, who dictates emotional reality by claiming to feel on behalf of others what those others may not even feel themselves. You must learn to see that your sensitivity is not exempt from the dynamics of power. It is already a sophisticated form of power in disguise. To feel another's pain without their explicit permission is to touch their soul without consent, to invade their psychic space as surely as if you had entered their home uninvited. To merge with their emotional world as though it were your natural right is to colonize their inner experience, to make their feelings your possession. To carry their burden as though you know better than they do what they need is to exercise a subtle but profound form of control over their psychological process. The empath believes they are selfless, humble servants of others' well-being, but unconsciously they feed upon the very energy they claim to give away so freely. They derive meaning, identity, purpose, and even a secret sense of superiority from their openness to others' pain. Their entire sense of self-worth depends upon being needed, upon being the one who understands when others don't, the one who cares when others can't, the one who sacrifices when others won't. Thus, they too play the game of power, though they disguise it so effectively that they themselves believe their own performance. But perhaps most disturbing of all is this recognition. Much of what you call empathy is actually projection. The unconscious casting of your own unlived emotions onto others, where they appear safer and more manageable to experience. You feel not the other's authentic inner experience, but yourself reflected in them like a funhouse mirror. You imagine their sorrow, their fear, their desperate hunger for understanding and connection, when in truth, you are encountering your own abandoned inner child, your own silenced rage, your own unwept tears that you have never dared to feel directly, because you cannot face these overwhelming emotions in yourself, because they threaten the carefully constructed identity of the strong one, the helper, the one who has transcended personal needs through service to others. You seek them in others where they appear more manageable, where you can pretend that your compassion is purely altruistic, rather than a desperate, unconscious attempt to heal your own wounds through proxy. This projection creates a hall of mirrors in which nothing is what it appears to be. You think you are feeling their pain, but you are actually feeling your own pain reflected back at you. You think you are helping them heal, but you are actually trying to heal yourself through them. You think you are giving to them, but you are actually trying to give to the wounded child within yourself who never received what they needed. Have you ever wondered why empaths are so magnetically, almost compulsively drawn to narcissists like moths to flame? This is no accident of fate or cruel cosmic joke designed to torture sensitive souls. They are perfect psychological complements, two halves of the same dissociated whole, two sides of the same archetypal split. Where the empath is porous and dissolving, the narcissist is armored and rigid. Where the empath gives compulsively and endlessly, the narcissist takes compulsively and endlessly. Where the empath has lost all sense of personal boundaries and individual identity, the narcissist has nothing but grandiose self-image and impenetrable defenses. The empath sees in the narcissist the shadow of their own denied selfhood, the part of them that wants to be seen appreciated, considered important and special. They are drawn to the narcissist's apparent confidence, their ability to demand attention without guilt, their refusal to disappear into others' needs and expectations. The narcissist represents everything the empath has sacrificed in themselves: self-advocacy, boundary setting, the ability to prioritize their own needs without shame. Meanwhile, the narcissist sees in the empath the perfect audience for their psychological performance, the ideal repository for their emotional waste products, someone who will absorb their shame and reflect back only admiration and concern. The empath represents everything the narcissist cannot afford to acknowledge in themselves: vulnerability, genuine emotion, the capacity for authentic intimacy and connection. Together, they form a closed psychological circuit, a psychic marriage of light and shadow that appears to be love, but is actually mutual exploitation disguised as relationship. The empath gets to feel needed, important, and morally superior, while successfully avoiding their own needs and emotional development. The narcissist gets unlimited attention, emotional labor, and narcissistic supply, while successfully avoiding genuine intimacy and personal responsibility. Both participants remain fundamentally unconscious throughout this dance, trapped in a compulsive repetition that can continue for years or even decades without either person recognizing the true nature of what they are participating in. The empath believes they are loving and healing, while the narcissist believes they are receiving the love and admiration they deserve. Neither recognizes that they are feeding off each other in a vampiric exchange that ultimately depletes both participants. But awakening from this unconscious pattern requires confronting a terrifying truth that most empaths will do anything to avoid: that your empathy is not wholly pure, that it conceals motives and fears and manipulations you have never acknowledged, that your gift may be inseparable from your wound, that your compassion may be a sophisticated psychological defense against facing your own abandonment, your own neediness, your own desperate hunger for the love you never received. Consider the ancient symbol of the serpent swallowing its tail, the Ouroboros representing the eternal cycle of creation and destruction, for the endless process of death and rebirth that governs all life. The empath caught in unconscious patterns is like this mythical creature endlessly devouring itself in a cycle that appears to be growth but is actually psychological cannibalism. They give and give until they are completely empty, drained of all life force and authentic vitality. Then unconsciously demand repayment in the form of gratitude, recognition, emotional dependency, or martyrdom that makes others feel guilty for receiving so much. They rescue others from their pain and suffering, then subtly enslave them with the guilt of how much they have sacrificed, how much they have given up, how much they have suffered on their behalf. They dissolve their own identity completely in service of others, then desperately seek to find themselves again in the reflection of others' need for them, others' dependence on them, others' inability to function without them. This cycle appears virtuous and selfless on the surface, but is actually a form of sophisticated psychological cannibalism. The empath devours their own life force and offers it to others as a sacrifice, then feeds on the power dynamic this sacrifice creates. They become addicted to being needed because it provides the only sense of self they have ever known, even as it slowly kills everything authentic and vital within them. I have observed this pattern countless times in my practice. Empaths who cannot exist without crisis, who unconsciously seek out broken people because healthy individuals do not provide the same narcissistic supply of being desperately needed. They speak of wanting peace and healthy relationships, yet their actions consistently create drama and dependency. They complain about being drained, yet they resist any suggestion that they step back and allow others to solve their own problems. This is because the empath's identity has become so intertwined with their role as savior. that without someone to save, they experience existential terror. Who are they if they are not needed? What is their value if they are not useful? What is their purpose if they are not constantly giving themselves away? These questions reveal the profound emptiness at the core of the empathic identity. An emptiness that can only be filled through the genuine work of individuation, not through endless self-sacrifice. The most tragic aspect of this pattern is that it perpetuates the very suffering it claims to heal. By constantly rescuing others from the consequences of their choices, the empath prevents them from developing the inner strength that comes only through facing difficulties alone. By absorbing others' emotions rather than teaching them to process their own feelings, the empath creates emotional dependence rather than emotional maturity. By solving others' problems rather than supporting them in finding their own solutions, the empath creates learned helplessness rather than empowerment. To break free from this ancient cycle of unconscious exchange requires what the mystics and alchemists called the dark night of the soul, a descent into the terrifying territory of absolute solitude, where you must face your own essential emptiness without the familiar distraction of others' needs, without the comfortable identity of the helper and healer, without any external validation of your worth or even your existence. For the empath, this prospect is more terrifying than physical death itself. To say no to someone's desperate request for help feels like committing murder. To set a boundary with someone who claims to need you feels like the cruelest betrayal of everyone who has ever trusted you with their pain. To withdraw your energy from another's suffering feels like abandoning them to certain destruction, like walking away from a drowning person simply because you are tired of swimming. The very thought of not being needed triggers tsunami waves of panic, guilt, shame, and existential terror that can be almost unbearable to experience. Who are you if you are not the helper? What is your value if you are not useful? What is your identity if you are not needed? These questions cut to the core of the empath's constructed self, threatening to reveal the terrifying void that lies beneath all their compulsive giving. And yet, without this courage, the courage to disappoint others, to be seen as selfish, to risk being unloved and abandoned, you will never find your authentic self. You will live eternally as an appendage of others, a shadow cast by their needs, a mirror reflecting their desires and demands, never as your own sovereign soul with your own legitimate right to exist independently of others' requirements and expectations. This is why individuation is not a luxury for those who have time for personal development and self-improvement, but an absolute necessity for psychological survival. It is the rescue of the authentic self from dissolution, the reclaiming of your own psychic territory from the colonizing forces of others' projections, the planting of roots in the solid ground of your own being, rather than the shifting sands of others' approval. Without this deep rooting in selfhood, empathy becomes a form of slow psychological suicide, a gradual dissolution of everything authentic until nothing remains but a hollow shell that exists only to serve others' needs. With this rooting, empathy transforms from compulsion into conscious choice, from vampiric exchange into genuine gift, from psychological prison into spiritual illumination. The path of individuation for the empath requires learning to reclaim their power, not the crude power of domination that they fear and despise, not the narcissistic power that seeks to control and manipulate others, but the fundamental power that every human soul possesses by birthright, the power to exist as themselves, to occupy space in the world, without apology, to have needs and boundaries and preferences that matter regardless of how others respond to them. Power, you see, is not inherently evil, as so many sensitive souls have been taught to believe. True power is simply the capacity to stand in your own being without requiring permission from others, to radiate your authentic essence, without needing validation or approval, to know your own value, independent of external recognition or appreciation. The empath must learn to embrace this power consciously and deliberately, or they will remain forever surrendering their life force to others who have no such qualms about claiming what they want from the world. Think of the magnificent oak tree standing alone in a vast meadow. It does not fear being rooted deeply in its own ground. It does not apologize for drawing water and nutrients from the earth for its own survival and growth. It does not collapse with guilt when other plants do not receive its shade or shelter. It stands firm and tall, reaches confidently toward the light. And precisely because it maintains its own structural integrity and nourishment, it can provide shelter, oxygen, and beauty for countless other beings without depleting itself. This is the perfect model for transformed empathy. Deeply rooted in self-knowledge and self-care, sustainably generous, rather than compulsively giving, offering genuine gifts rather than unconscious sacrifice. The tree gives abundantly, but it gives from overflow rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness, from choice rather than compulsion. But to become this integrated being, you must first face your shadow without flinching, without denial, without the comfortable illusions that have protected your ego from uncomfortable truths. You must confess insights that will shatter your carefully constructed self-image and force you to see yourself as you really are, rather than as you have pretended to be. You must acknowledge, I was not only compassionate, I was desperately afraid of being abandoned and unloved. I was not only selfless, I was manipulating others through my sacrifice, controlling them through my martyrdom. I was not only loving, I was hungry for the love I never received, and was trying to earn it through my usefulness, trying to purchase it through my indispensability. This confession is not an act of self-attack or self-hatred, but rather the beginning of genuine self-liberation. When you can see your own unconscious manipulations clearly and honestly, they begin to lose their power over you. When you can acknowledge your own needs and fears without shame, you can begin to meet them directly, rather than seeking to fulfill them through the twisted pathway of others' dependence on you. Consider for a moment the patient I once worked with, a woman who had spent 40 years of her life as the family's emotional caretaker. She came to me, broken, describing herself as a hollow shell who existed only to absorb others' pain. Through our work together, she discovered that her compulsive giving was rooted in a childhood terror of abandonment. Her mother had been emotionally unavailable, lost in her own depression, and the only way this little girl could get attention was by becoming hyper-attuned to her mother's needs. As an adult, she had unconsciously recreated this dynamic in every relationship, always giving more than she received, always sensing others' needs before her own, always sacrificing herself on the altar of others' comfort. But when she finally understood the psychological mechanism driving her behavior, when she could see that her empathy was actually a sophisticated survival strategy rather than a pure spiritual gift, she began the slow work of reclaiming her authentic self. The process was excruciating. Family members accused her of becoming selfish when she stopped automatically solving their problems. Friends drifted away when she was no longer available for endless emotional support. She experienced profound guilt, fear, and loneliness as she learned to tolerate others' disappointment without immediately rushing to fix their discomfort. But gradually, something beautiful emerged. Her relationships became more authentic as she stopped attracting people who wanted to use her energy. Her empathy became more accurate as she stopped projecting her own emotions onto others. Her help became more effective as she stopped enabling dysfunction through her compulsive rescuing. She discovered that being truly helpful often meant saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing others to develop their own inner resources. The collective consciousness will resist your awakening with tremendous force. For your transformation threatens the comfortable dynamics that others have grown accustomed to enjoying. Those who have benefited from your endless availability, your compulsive caretaking, your inability to say no, will not celebrate your newfound boundaries and self-respect. They will call you selfish, claim you have changed for the worse, perhaps even accuse you of being cruel, uncaring, or spiritually regressed. And in a sense, they are absolutely right. You are changing. You are becoming someone who can no longer be taken for granted, someone who values their own well-being enough to protect it. Someone who recognizes that their energy and attention are precious resources that should not be squandered on those who give nothing in return. This threatens the comfortable parasitic relationship they have enjoyed, and they will fight to restore the status quo that served them so well. You may have unconsciously believed that you were indispensable, that without your constant care and attention, others would collapse into chaos, despair, or destruction. But this grandiose fantasy is actually a disguised form of arrogance, a hidden inflation that serves your ego's need to feel important and special. Each soul has their own unique relationship with suffering, their own lessons to learn through struggle, their own inner strength to discover through adversity. To constantly intervene in others' natural processes of growth through challenge is not compassion, but interference. Not love, but a subtle form of violence that denies others their dignity and their fundamental right to wrestle with their own shadows, to learn from their own mistakes, to develop their own resources and resilience. Your endless giving may not be the salvation you imagine it to be, but rather a theft of others' opportunities to develop their own capacities, their own inner strength, their own direct connection to their personal power. Your compulsive rescuing may be robbing them of the very experiences that would make them whole, keeping them dependent and emotionally infantile, rather than supporting their evolution into mature, self-responsible, psychologically integrated human beings. This recognition can be absolutely devastating to the empath's carefully constructed sense of self, for it reveals that much of what they believed was virtuous was actually harmful, that their greatest source of pride was actually their most destructive weakness, that their identity as a selfless helper was actually a sophisticated form of control that served their own unconscious needs far more than anyone else's genuine well-being. What emerges from this dark passage through the underworld of the psyche is not the death of empathy, but its resurrection in conscious, sustainable, genuinely helpful form. When you finally stand rooted in the solid ground of your own being, when you have integrated both the light and shadow aspects of your nature, your empathy becomes radiant rather than compulsive, flowing like clear mountain water, rather than draining like blood from an open wound. It nourishes without enslaving, heals without controlling, loves without devouring or being devoured. Imagine such a soul. They stand unshaken by others' emotional storms, luminous with their own inner light, rather than merely reflecting others' needs and projections. When someone approaches them carrying sorrow, rage, despair, or any form of suffering, the awakened empath feels it with exquisite sensitivity. Yes, but does not drown in the ocean of that emotion. They witness it with profound compassion and understanding, yes, but do not collapse under its weight or lose themselves in its intensity. They offer genuine love and healing presence, yes, but remain fundamentally themselves throughout the entire encounter. In the presence of such an individual, others feel genuinely seen and understood, rather than absorbed and consumed. They feel held in loving awareness, rather than controlled through anxious concern. They feel witnessed in their pain, rather than rescued from it before they have had a chance to learn from it. This is the crucial difference between authentic empathy and emotional enmeshment, between conscious compassion and unconscious codependence, between love that liberates and love that imprisons through good intentions. This transformation represents a fundamental shift from fusion to authentic relationship, from unconscious compulsion to conscious choice, from survival-based empathy to grace-based compassion. The awakened empath no longer needs others to be broken, needy, or dependent in order to feel valuable and important. They no longer require endless gratitude or emotional dependency to know their own worth. They can be genuinely helpful precisely because they are not compulsively driven to help, not addicted to being needed, not unconsciously feeding off others' weakness and vulnerability. The ancient mystics and spiritual teachers understood this paradox perfectly. They spoke of detachment not as cold indifference or heartless withdrawal, but as the capacity to love, without possession, to care deeply, without attachment to specific outcomes, to give generously, without depleting themselves or creating unhealthy dependency in others. They knew that only a self firmly rooted in its own ground can open fully to another's experience, without being consumed by it, can offer genuine support and healing, without losing itself in the process. You were never meant to be a martyr, bleeding yourself dry for unconscious souls who mistake your sacrifice for love, who confuse your depletion with devotion. You were never meant to disappear completely into others' needs, until nothing authentic remains of your own essence, your own dreams, your own legitimate desires and aspirations. You were meant to be a whole, integrated, psychologically mature being whose very presence illuminates the darkness without being consumed by it, whose empathy flows from inner fullness rather than emptiness, whose compassion serves life and growth rather than unconscious psychological patterns that keep everyone trapped in immaturity. Let me paint for you a picture of what this transformed empathy looks like in practice. The conscious empath enters a room and immediately senses the emotional atmosphere. But instead of automatically absorbing whatever they feel, they maintain their center while observing with compassionate detachment. When someone shares their pain, the awakened empath listens with genuine presence, but does not take on the emotion as their own. They feel with others, not for others. When asked for help, they pause and ask themselves, is this request coming from genuine need or unconscious manipulation? Will my help empower this person or create dependence? Am I being asked to do something this person could do for themselves? What is my motivation for wanting to help? Compassion or compulsion? Based on these reflections, they choose consciously whether and how to respond. The transformed empath has learned to distinguish between their own emotions and others' projections. They recognize when someone is trying to make them responsible for feelings that belong to that person. They can witness suffering without needing to fix it, understanding that some pain serves a necessary purpose in the other person's growth and development. Most importantly, the conscious empath has developed what I call emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain themselves regardless of the emotional chaos around them. They are like a mountain that provides shelter from the storm without being moved by the wind. This stability becomes a gift to others, showing them what it looks like to be centered, boundaried, and authentically present. The world does not need more unconscious empaths, sacrificing themselves on the altar of others' unprocessed shadows, enabling others' irresponsibility through their compulsive caretaking. The world desperately needs individuals whose empathy is truly powerful, because their boundaries are crystal clear, whose compassion runs genuinely deep, because they have courageously faced and integrated their own suffering rather than avoiding it through constant focus on others' pain. What the world needs is human beings whose presence is genuinely healing, because they are no longer caught in the unconscious game of power that masquerades as love, no longer driven by the compulsions that turn gifts into curses and strengths into weaknesses. The world needs empaths who have learned to stand as whole selves, radiating authentic love rather than unconscious need, offering genuine healing rather than enabling dysfunction. This transformation is your most sacred task as an empath. Not to abandon your extraordinary sensitivity or close your heart to others' suffering, but to bring your gift into the full light of consciousness. Not to suppress your natural compassion, but to understand and integrate the shadow aspects of your empathic nature. When you can finally see with clear eyes that your empathy is inseparable from your original wound, that your compassion often conceals your deepest fears and unmet needs, that your openness sometimes hides your terror of genuine solitude and self-responsibility, then you begin to be truly free. Free not from empathy itself, but from the unconscious compulsions that have enslaved you in its name. Free to love without losing yourself in the beloved, to give without disappearing into the gift, to feel others' pain, without drowning in the vast ocean of collective suffering that surrounds us all. This is individuation for the empath, the sacred movement from unconscious wound to conscious gift, from shadow-driven patterns to authentic relationship, from the prison of compulsive caring to the freedom of conscious compassion. Every empath walking this earth is caught in this ancient game of power until they develop the courage to awaken from its hypnotic spell. You can continue to deny the shadow aspects of your gift and remain enslaved to unconscious patterns that drain your life force and prevent your authentic development. Or you can confront these uncomfortable truths and discover the genuine freedom that lies on the other side of illusion. The choice, as always, is entirely yours to make. But know this with absolute certainty. Your liberation serves not only your own soul's evolution, but every single life you touch. When you finally stand whole and conscious in your empathic gift, when you can feel deeply without losing yourself, when you can love powerfully without being consumed by that love, you become what you were always meant to be. Not a wounded healer perpetuating cycles of unconscious exchange, but a radiant presence whose very being demonstrates that it is possible to care deeply while remaining authentically, unshakably yourself. Your empathy, transformed through the fire of consciousness, becomes not a chain that binds you to others' unconscious patterns and projections, but a light that illuminates the path to genuine healing, authentic relationship, and the kind of love that truly liberates rather than enslaves. This is your ultimate destiny, your greatest gift to a suffering world, and your final freedom from the ancient game that has held you captive for far too long. But let me speak to you now about the practical reality of this transformation. For awakening is not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual process of conscious choice-making that must be renewed each day. The patterns that have enslaved you were carved deep into your psyche over years or decades. They will not disappear overnight simply because you understand them intellectually. You will find yourself again and again pulled back into the old patterns, feeling guilty when you say no, anxious when others are upset, compulsive in your desire to fix and heal and save. This is not failure. This is the natural process of psychological transformation. Each time you recognize the pattern and choose differently, you strengthen your capacity for conscious empathy. The first stage of this transformation often feels like death itself. You will experience what mystics call the desert of the soul, a period where your old identity crumbles, but your new self has not yet fully emerged. You may feel selfish, heartless, even cruel as you learn to set boundaries. Others may reinforce these feelings, accusing you of changing for the worse. This is the most dangerous time, when many empaths retreat back into unconscious patterns rather than endure the discomfort of growth. But if you persist through this dark passage, if you can tolerate being misunderstood while you learn to understand yourself, something miraculous begins to emerge. Your empathy becomes selective rather than indiscriminate. You learn to distinguish between genuine calls for help and manipulative demands for energy. You develop what I call conscious permeability, the ability to open and close your psychic boundaries at will rather than living in a state of constant openness that invites invasion. You begin to recognize the difference between empathy and emotional contagion, between compassion and codependence, between helping and enabling. You discover that the most loving thing you can do for someone is often to allow them to experience the consequences of their choices rather than rescuing them from natural learning opportunities. Most importantly, you learn that your energy is sacred, that your emotional resources are finite and precious, that protecting your inner sanctuary is not selfishness, but spiritual responsibility. You realize that you cannot pour from an empty cup, that maintaining your own psychological health is a prerequisite for genuinely helping others rather than simply perpetuating cycles of unconscious exchange. The awakened empath stands as a beacon of hope in a world hungry for authentic love, demonstrating that it is possible to feel everything without being destroyed by it, to give everything without being depleted by it, to love everyone without losing yourself in the process. This is the transformation the world desperately needs, and this is the sacred work that calls to your soul. If these words have touched something deep within your soul, and if you recognize yourself in both the shadows and the light I have described, I invite you to share your own journey of awakening in the comments below. What patterns have you discovered in your empathic experiences? How has your sensitivity both blessed and burdened your life? What steps are you taking to transform unconscious compassion into conscious love? Your story matters profoundly, and in courageously sharing it, you help others recognize their own path from empathic enslavement to conscious freedom. Subscribe to continue this exploration into the deepest mysteries of human psychology, where we illuminate the shadows that secretly govern our lives and discover the authentic light that sets us free.